maintain households, respond to instruction with remarkable efficiency. Hogwarts is full of echoes from the past, some polite, some bitter, some impossible to ignore. But the strangest part isn't that ghosts remain at the castle, it's that after all this time, they're still here, watching, listening, remembering. At Hogwarts, ghosts are often treated as part of the background, familiar figures drifting through corridors, classrooms, and candlelit halls as though they've always belonged there. Students barely react, professors rarely comment, and before long, the unusual begins to feel entirely normal. But every ghost at Hogwarts was once a living witch or wizard, with ambitions, mistakes, loyalties, and unfinished concerns of their own. Some stayed out of attachment, others out of regret, and some, perhaps, for reasons they've never fully shared. Because the real mystery isn't who they are, it's what they know and why they never seem to leave. And few ghosts embody that better than the one who never quite lost his head. Nearly Headless Nick. Nearly Headless Nick is often treated as one of Hogwarts's friendliest traditions, a familiar face at feasts, a polite guide through Gryffindor Tower, and a ghost who seems far more approachable than most. But long before the castle knew him by that name, he was Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington, a wizard of status, reputation, and, by all accounts, a certain pride. His final chapter, however, did not go cleanly. A sentence was carried out and famously mishandled, which left him suspended between two identities, not fully remembered as the man he was, and not entirely respected as the ghost he became. Even now, the nickname remains, Nearly Headless Nick. Spoken with affection, perhaps, but still a reminder of the one moment he can never escape. He is most often found near Gryffindor Tower, the Great Hall, and the castle corridors, always close to student life, always close to belonging. And that may be the most revealing detail of all. Because for someone who has remained at Hogwarts for centuries, Nick still seems to want the same thing he wanted all along: to be included, to be recognized, to matter, which suggests that even after passing on, insecurity does not always disappear. Some concerns simply learn to float. And Nick is not the only ghost at Hogwarts carrying something unfinished, because in the quieter parts of the castle, another ghost keeps far older secrets: the Grey Lady. The Grey Lady is rarely the loudest presence at Hogwarts. She does not command attention in the way other ghosts do. She drifts quietly through towers and corridors, seen more often than spoken to. Which is fitting, because silence seems to be part of who she is. But the Grey Lady is no ordinary ghost. She is Helena Ravenclaw, daughter of Rowena Ravenclaw herself, which means that for centuries, one of Hogwarts' founders remained part of the castle's story through her. And with that connection came knowledge few others possessed. She is most closely associated with Ravenclaw Tower, though like many ghosts, she appears where she chooses, often in the quieter corners of the school where questions are less common. Reserved, distant, difficult to read. Yet beneath that calm presence sits one of Hogwarts' most significant hidden stories. Because Helena Ravenclaw once took something of great importance from her mother and kept its whereabouts hidden for years. A secret so well buried that even within Hogwarts it remained out of reach, which makes her presence at the castle especially curious. She did not remain to be celebrated. She did not remain to be noticed. If anything, she remained beside the very place her silence helped shape. Some ghosts stay because they cannot let go, others because they remember too much. And if the Grey Lady represents secrecy, the next ghost is something else entirely. Because not every presence at Hogwarts is quiet. A bloody baron. Some ghosts at Hogwarts are welcomed, others are tolerated, and then there is the Bloody Baron. He, does not drift through the castle with friendliness or curiosity. He arrives with silence, unease, and a reputation that seems to move ahead of him. Even those who do not know his story tend to understand the feeling, because fear has a way of lingering. The Baron is most closely tied to Slytherin House, where he serves as its resident ghost. He is often seen in the dungeons, the lower corridors, and the older parts of the castle, where shadows tend to gather first. Unlike other spirits at Hogwarts, he is not remembered for charm or conversation. He is remembered for what surrounds him, the stained appearance of his robes, the chain he carries, the silence he keeps. And perhaps most telling of all, even Peeves answers to him. In a castle filled with students, teachers, portraits, creatures, and chaos, that may be one of the strongest endorsements of his presence possible. Yet, beneath the fear, there is something else. Because ghosts do not remain unchanged, and the Baron has always felt less like anger and more like burden, as though whatever brought him to Hogwarts in this form never truly left with the years, which is a reminder that some reputations are built on noise, others on what refuses to be said, and few ghosts at Hogwarts are louder than the next one, despite never needing to whisper at all. Now, it's easy to treat Hogwarts ghosts as curiosities, decorations in corridors, traditions in chains, familiar figures drifting past so often they barely seem unusual at all. But they are something else entirely. Proof that some choices, some regrets, and some moments echo for far longer than expected. Moaning Myrtle. Moaning Myrtle is often remembered for the noise first. The wailing, the complaints, the dramatic entrances from plumbing no one asked her to use. At Hogwarts, she is easy to dismiss as an inconvenience. A ghost students avoid unless they have no choice. But Myrtle was not always a punchline in a bathroom. She was once a student, young, overlooked, and by most accounts deeply unhappy, long before she became a ghost. And unlike many spirits at Hogwarts, the moment that bound her to the castle is tied directly to one of its oldest mysteries. She is most often found in the bathroom that bears her name, though she has never shown much respect for walls, privacy, or expected boundaries. Which, for Myrtle, may be part of the point, because while other ghosts drift through halls or return to familiar houses, Myrtle remains close to a single moment, not a century, not a legacy, a moment, as though time, for her, never moved properly afterwards. And that may explain why she feels so different from the others. Nick looks for belonging. The Grey Lady carries silence. The Baron carries burden. Myrtle carries hurt, loudly, repeatedly, and without disguise, which makes her easy to laugh at and surprisingly difficult to ignore. Because some hauntings are not about places at all, they are about the moment someone never truly left, and if one ghost is trapped in the past, the next barely noticed he stayed at all. Professor Binns. Some ghosts at Hogwarts announce themselves immediately. They rattle chains, interrupt corridors, drift through walls, or make certain bathrooms impossible to enjoy. Professor Binns does none of that. He simply continues, lesson after lesson, year after year, decade after decade, perhaps longer than anyone has bothered to count. He is the long-serving professor of history of magic, and one of the only teachers at Hogwarts whose greatest talent may be being overlooked. Because Binns did not dramatically return to the castle. He did not arrive with unfinished vengeance, or hidden secrets, or spectral theatrics. He is said to have slipped away in his sleep beside the staff room fire, and then simply got up and carried on teaching as though nothing at all had changed. Which may be the most Hogwarts detail imaginable. He is most often found in his classroom, delivering the same measured lectures to rows of increasingly distracted students, many of whom seem less concerned that their teacher is a ghost than they are about staying awake. And yet, beneath the dry voice and drifting routine, there is something remarkable about him. Because while others chase mystery, drama, or legend, Binns has spent years preserving memory, goblin rebellions, ancient disputes, forgotten laws, the details no one values until they suddenly matter. No one listens to Professor Binns, which may be why he keeps talking. And if Binns represents the past being ignored, the castle's strangest resident represents something else entirely, because the final presence on this list was never a ghost at all. Peeves. Peeves is often spoken about as though he belongs with the ghosts of Hogwarts. He floats through corridors, appears without warning, and has made generations of students regret carrying anything breakable. But Peeves is not a ghost. He was never a student who remained, never a professor who carried on, never a figure from the castle's past refusing to leave. Peeves is something far less tidy, a poltergeist, less a spirit of the dead, more a force born from life inside the castle itself, which means he is not defined by memory, but by disturbance. He does not preserve Hogwarts. He tests it. Doors slammed at the wrong moment, objects launched with suspicious accuracy, songs composed entirely to embarrass whoever least deserves peace that day. And somehow, he always seems to know exactly where the trouble will be. He is found everywhere and nowhere in particular. Staircases, classrooms, torchlit corridors, anywhere rules are being taken too seriously. Which may be why Peeves feels less like a resident and more like a symptom. As though Hogwarts, for all its history and grandeur, cannot contain that much youthful chaos without producing a personality for it. The Baron may command fear, Nick may seek belonging, Binns may preserve the past, but Peeves does something entirely different. He reminds everyone that even the oldest castle in the wizarding world can still behave like a child, and perhaps that is the strangest secret of all. Not every presence at Hogwarts comes from what happened before. Some are created by what never stops happening. Perhaps that is the real lesson of Hogwarts Ghosts. They are not just echoes of the past, but reminders that some choices, some regrets, and some stories never fade as neatly as we imagine. Which does leave one question. If you could speak to just one ghost of Hogwarts, who would you choose, and what would you ask? Let me know below. And if you find yourself drawn to the stranger corners of the wizarding world, you may want to stay a little longer. There's always more to uncover if you happen to be looking when the clock strikes odd. There are certain lessons at Hogwarts that were never meant to be easy, but a few went further than that, existing more on the edges of the curriculum, rarely documented, and, in some cases, quietly set aside. Hogwarts has always been known for its unusual approach to education, transfiguration, charms, even defense against the dark arts. All perfectly acceptable, at least on paper. But beyond the official timetable, there have often been other forms of learning. Subjects not widely taught, skills passed on more selectively, and areas of magic that raised more questions than answers. These subjects were not removed entirely, just no longer openly discussed. Number 10. Apparition. Advanced practice. Apparition is often described as a convenience, a way to travel instantly from one place to another. Efficient, elegant, useful. Providing, of course, that everything arrives together. Because apparition is not simply movement, it is precision, the kind that leaves very little room for error. Students are typically introduced to it outside the standard Hogwarts curriculum, under more controlled conditions. Even with perfect focus, things don't always go to plan. Some skills, it seems, require a different kind of supervision.
Are you all right, dearie?
But physical travel, as complex as it is, is nothing compared to navigating the mind. Number 9. Occlumency. Selective teaching. Not all forms of magic were taught openly at Hogwarts. Some were passed on more selectively. Occlumency is one of them. There are no incantations, no visible signs, only control, the ability to organize your thoughts, to shield them, to keep them exactly where they belong. It sounds simple, until you realize how difficult it is to control something that rarely stays still. And for those who struggle, well, not every thought is meant to be seen. Of course, protection only becomes necessary when there is something to protect against. Number 8. Legilimency. Rarely taught. If occlumency is defense, then legilimency becomes something else entirely. The ability to access the thoughts of another, not just surface ideas, but memories, emotions, moments long forgotten. It is not something listed among standard subjects, and perhaps that's the point, because once a skill like this becomes reliable, it raises a rather uncomfortable question: who decides when it should be used? Not all questionable magic involves the mind. Some of it is far more immediate. Number 7. Care of magical creatures. In practice. In theory, the subject is straightforward, an introduction to magical creatures, their habits, their behavior. But in practice, it depends entirely on the creature. Some respond well to respect, others require distance, and a few require both. There have been moments where lessons introduced creatures that were perhaps ambitious choices, fascinating certainly, but not always ideal for inexperienced students, which may explain why the approach to this subject has shifted over time. Still, creatures can be studied, observed, understood. Time itself, however, is far less predictable. Number 6. Time turners. Use strictly controlled. Time turners are rarely discussed in detail, and for good reason. The concept is simple enough, a controlled way to revisit recent moments. But even limited use introduces complications. Cause and effect begin to blur. Small actions carry unexpected weight, and once you start adjusting time, it becomes increasingly difficult to predict what follows. Time turners were never part of formal teaching, but on rare occasions limited guidance was permitted, carefully, quietly, and never for long. Now, before we go any further, it's worth remembering something about Hogwarts. Not every form of magic was ever intended to be comfortable, only necessary, which does raise an interesting question. Where exactly is that line? Because some areas of study didn't just blur boundaries, they challenged them entirely. Number 5. Non-verbal spellcasting. Advanced magic. Most spells are taught with clear incantations. Words provide structure, focus, stability, but at more advanced levels, those words disappear. Non-verbal spellcasting relies entirely on intent. No sound, no warning, just thought, becoming action. It's faster, more efficient, and significantly harder to detect, which makes it incredibly useful, and depending on the situation, not always ideal in untrained hands. Of course, controlling magic is one thing. Understanding what it reveals is another. Number 4. Divination. When it works. Divination is often dismissed, unreliable, vague, open to interpretation, and most of the time, that's fair. But every so often, a prediction proves accurate, and when that happens, the tone changes. Because a single correct insight raises a difficult possibility. What if it wasn't chance? And if it wasn't, how much of the future should really be known in advance? Some subjects attempt to prepare students for what might happen. Others focus on what already has. Number 3. Defense against the dark arts. The pattern. few subjects are considered more important. Practical, essential, necessary. And yet, this particular position has a history. One that's difficult to ignore. Year after year, the teaching changes, instructors come and go. Consistency is rare. It isn't the content that raises questions, it's the pattern. Year after year, no one holds the position for long, as if something or someone never intended it to be taught consistently at all. And then, there are the areas of magic that exist just beyond structural learning. Number 2. Experimental spellwork. Spell creation is not something typically taught, for good reason, because designing magic is very different from using it. It requires understanding structure, intent, consequence. And even then, results can vary. There are quiet references to advanced students exploring beyond standard spells, testing combinations, adjusting outcomes. Not as part of any formal lesson, but certainly not entirely unheard of, at least not at first. Which brings us to something slightly more unusual. Number 1. The Forbidden Forest. Practical exposure. The Forbidden Forest is not a classroom, at least not officially. And yet, students have been sent there. Usually as a punishment, but occasionally guided, supervised to a degree. The reasoning is often practical. Experience, exposure, real-world understanding. But the forest is not predictable. It doesn't behave like a lesson. And it doesn't always respond the way one might expect, which makes it a curious choice, because some environments don't teach, they test, and not every student returns with the same understanding they left with. Hogwarts has always been a place of learning, but as with any place of knowledge, there are limits. Lines that are drawn and occasionally crossed. Some forms of magic are restricted for a reason, others simply fade from discussion. Which does leave one question. If given the choice, would you have explored any of these areas of magic? Or are some things better left unstudied? Is there a subject you've come across that perhaps shouldn't have been taught? Let me know in the comments section. I'd be curious to hear what you've found. And if you'd like more content like this, subscribe. There's always more to uncover, if you happen to be looking when the clock strikes odd. House elves are often described as loyal, helpful, and remarkably dedicated. But there are certain things that should never be said to one, not because they won't respond, but because they will. While much of wizarding society takes their presence for granted, the rules surrounding house elves are surprisingly specific and occasionally misunderstood, because some phrases, however harmless they may seem, don't always mean what you think they do. Now, before any of this makes sense, it helps to understand one thing. House elves don't follow the same rules as anyone else. They are bound to wizarding households, not just by expectation, but by magic. Their role is defined by service, their loyalty reinforced over time, and their freedom governed by very specific conditions. Which means that, unlike most conversations, even the simplest words can carry consequences, and some more than others. Number 10. You're free now. The words, "you're free now." On the surface, this sounds like a kindness, a release from obligation, a gesture offered with the best of intentions. But within the structure of wizarding households, house elves operate under a very different set of rules. Freedom is not gradually earned, nor is it casually granted. It is defined, quite specifically, by the presentation of clothing, not as a suggestion, not as a possibility, but as a condition, which means that even an unintended action can carry a meaning far beyond what was intended. A misplaced item, a poorly timed gesture, a sentence spoken without full understanding, and suddenly something permanent has taken place. Not negotiated, not discussed, simply triggered, which makes this particular phrase surprisingly dangerous, not because it's unkind, but because, in the right context, it works. Number 9. I'll do it myself. I'll do it myself. A simple statement, and, in most cases, an entirely reasonable one. It suggests independence, efficiency, perhaps even a desire not to inconvenience anyone else. But for a house elf, the meaning is not quite so straightforward. Their role is not simply to assist, it is to serve. Not occasionally, not when convenient, but as a defining part of their identity. Tasks are not interruptions, they are expectations. And more than that, they are purpose. So when that purpose is removed, even briefly, it doesn't create relief, it creates uncertainty. A moment where the structure they rely on simply disappears, which, depending on the individual, can be more unsettling than the task itself. Because if there is nothing to do, nothing to correct, nothing to improve, then the question becomes, what remains? And for a house elf, that question is not always a comfortable one. Number 8. Why do you enjoy this? Why do you enjoy this? It's a reasonable question, one that, from a wizard's perspective, comes from curiosity, perhaps even concern. After all, the work of a house elf can seem relentless, repetitive, demanding, occasionally even uncomfortable to observe. So the instinct is to question it, to understand it, to look for an explanation that aligns with familiar thinking. But not all motivations translate cleanly across different ways of living. What appears burdensome to one may feel entirely natural to another. And for many house elves, service is not simply something they do, it is something they are, which makes this question more complicated than it first appears. Number 7. You don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. A reassurance intended to ease responsibility, to reduce effort, to remove pressure. But for a house elf, instruction provides structure, clarity, direction, expectation, and without it, things become less certain. Not easier, just less defined. Which means removing a task does not always remove the burden. Sometimes it simply replaces it with something less familiar. And for a house elf, uncertainty is not always preferable to duty. Number 6. Stop punishing yourself. Stop punishing yourself. It sounds like concern, a reasonable response to behavior that at first glance seems unnecessarily harsh. And from a wizard's perspective, that reaction makes sense, because house elves are known to correct themselves, sometimes in ways that appear excessive. A mistake is made, a rule is broken, an expectation is not met, and the response is immediate. Not imposed from outside, but carried out from within, which suggests that, for a house elf, discipline is not simply enforced, it is internalized. So when someone steps in to stop it, even with the best intentions, it doesn't always bring relief, because what appears to be help may actually interrupt something they believe is necessary. Now, it's worth remembering, house elves don't see things the same way wizards do, which makes certain conversations surprisingly complicated. Number 5. You belong to me. You belong to me. A statement that, in certain contexts, reflects the structure of wizarding society. House elves are, after all, bound to households, to families, to long-standing magical agreements that are rarely questioned and even less often explained. So, on the surface, the statement is not entirely inaccurate, but it is not usually spoken so directly, because within that structure, there is a difference between what is understood and what is set. The bond itself is not simply about ownership, it is about expectation, obligation, and a form of loyalty that operates under its own rules. which means that stating it plainly changes something. It shifts the tone from assumption to declaration, from structure to emphasis. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, does not always go unnoticed, because some things function more smoothly when they are left unspoken. Number 4. You're just a servant. You're just a servant. A simplification, and, in the broadest sense, not entirely incorrect. House elves do serve. They carry out tasks, maintain households, respond to instruction with remarkable efficiency. But reducing that role to a single word overlooks something more complex, because for a house elf, service is not simply an activity. It is not a task to be completed or a role to be set aside. It is identity, a structure they operate within and, in many cases, fully accept, which means describing it so plainly removes the context that gives it meaning. It flattens something that is, in reality, far more layered, not incorrect, but incomplete. And sometimes it's that incompleteness that makes a statement feel slightly off. Number 3. Can you lie for me? Can you lie for me? A question that seems simple enough, a request made in passing, often without much consideration. But for a house elf, it introduces a complication, because obedience is not always as straightforward as it appears. Instructions are followed, but within a structure, a set of expectations that govern what can be done and how it is carried out. And when those instructions begin to conflict, something becomes uncertain, not visibly, not immediately, but internally, which makes a request like this less predictable than it first appears. Number 2. Ignore your master. Ignore your master. A direct contradiction, and one that creates immediate tension, because a house elf is bound to obey, not loosely, not occasionally, but completely, which means that when one instruction opposes another, something doesn't align. The magic that binds them does not simply disappear. It doesn't pause or wait for clarification. It continues to enforce both expectations at once. Obey, disobey, and, for a house elf, that contradiction isn't theoretical, it's immediate. There are accounts of visible distress, hesitation, confusion, not because they don't understand the instruction, but because they understand both, and cannot resolve the difference between them. Which makes a command like this more than just disruptive. It forces a system built on certainty into something unstable. And instability is not something house elves are designed to handle. Number 1. Take these clothes. Take these clothes. A simple gesture, and, in most cases, a generous one. But for a house elf, it carries a very specific meaning. Clothing is not symbolic, it is definitive. It marks the end of service, not gradually, not conditionally, but immediately. Which means that even an unintended action can have a permanent outcome. A folded garment, a casual offering, a moment of kindness misunderstood, and suddenly, the bond is gone. Which makes this the most dangerous phrase of all. Not because it is harmful, but because it works exactly as intended. It's curious, really, how something so simple can mean something entirely different. Which does leave one question. If you found yourself in that position, would you treat a house elf any differently? Or would you follow the same rules, even knowing what they imply? Let me know what you think, and whether there's anything I've missed. And if you find yourself drawn to the stranger corners of the wizarding world, you may want to stay a little longer. There's always more to uncover if you happen to be looking when the clock strikes odd. Some witches and wizards are respected, others are followed, but a rare few are avoided entirely, not because they demand it, but because others understand what might happen if they don't. Because fear in the wizarding world is not always obvious. It isn't just about what someone can do or the reputation they carry. More often, it's about uncertainty, the kind that makes people hesitate, reconsider, or choose not to act at all. And that hesitation matters, because when enough people begin to step back, to speak more carefully, to avoid direct confrontation, something changes. Not in the individual being feared, but in the world around them. Decisions shift, boundaries move, and influence begins to grow without needing to be forced. Which is what makes certain witches and wizards so difficult to measure. Not simply powerful, but unpredictable. Not always visible, but always accounted for. And once someone reaches that point, they are no longer just respected, they are avoided. And sometimes, that kind of presence is felt most strongly in the ones you understand the least. Number 5. Severus Snape. Severus Snape was never the most obvious presence in the room. He didn't raise his voice unnecessarily, he didn't draw attention without purpose, and he rarely explained more than he needed to, which is precisely what made him difficult to read. Because with Snape, certainty was never guaranteed. His ability as a wizard was clear from an early stage. Exceptionally skilled in potion making, known to refine complex methods, and even develop spells of his own, he operated at a level few could match. But ability alone does not create fear. Uncertainty does, and Snape existed in a space where intentions were rarely obvious, a teacher whose loyalty was often questioned, a skilled occlumens capable of concealing thought itself, a figure who could stand in one place while appearing to belong in another, which meant that even those who worked alongside him were never entirely sure where they stood. And that hesitation matters. Because when people begin to second-guess what someone might do, they change how they act around them. They speak more carefully. They reveal less. They avoid direct confrontation where possible. And over time, that behavior becomes consistent. Which is what makes Snape so significant in a list like this. Not because he demanded fear, but because he created an environment where it was easier to be cautious than to be certain. And in the wizarding world, that kind of presence is rarely ignored. Because when someone cannot be read, they cannot be predicted. And when they cannot be predicted, they are often avoided. And Snape was not the only witch or wizard whose presence carried that effect, because the next name on this list removed uncertainty entirely and replaced it with something far more immediate. Number 4. Bellatrix Lestrange. Bellatrix Lestrange does not leave room for uncertainty. Where others hesitate, she acts. From an early stage, her magical ability was undeniable. Precise, fast, capable. A witch capable of executing complex spellwork with confidence that few could match. But it is not her ability alone that made others step back. It is how she used it. Bellatrix did not approach situations with caution or calculation in the way others might expect. She removed the pause. The moment where most witches and wizards reconsider, measure the outcome, or decide whether to act at all. And without that hesitation, everything becomes more immediate, more difficult to predict, more difficult to contain, and far more difficult to oppose. Which is why her presence alone was often enough to change behavior, not because others lacked ability, but because they understood that Bellatrix would not slow down. She would not wait, she would not adjust, and she would not stop once she had begun, and that kind of momentum creates a different kind of fear. Not quiet, like Snape, not uncertain, like those who operate in secrecy, but direct. The kind that forces a decision immediately, rather than allowing time to think. Which is why Bellatrix was never simply a powerful witch. She was a force others had to account for the moment she appeared, because when hesitation disappears, so does the advantage of preparation. And yet, even that level of fear is still contained when compared to what comes next. Because the next figure on this list did not rely on unpredictability, He gave people a reason to be afraid before anything had even begun. Number 3. Gellert Grindelwald. Gellert Grindelwald did not rely on unpredictability. In many ways, he removed it entirely. Where others created fear through sudden action, Grindelwald created it through certainty, because his intentions were clear. He believed the wizarding world should not remain hidden, not remain separate, and not remain restrained by systems he viewed as limitations. And more importantly, he was willing to act on that belief. Not impulsively, not recklessly, but with structure, which made him far more difficult to oppose, because Grindelwald's power was not just in his ability as a wizard, though that alone placed him among the most formidable of his time. It was in his clarity, a defined vision of how the world should function and a willingness to bring that vision into reality. And when power is supported by conviction, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes direction, which is why his influence spread so far and so quickly, not through chaos, like Bellatrix, not through uncertainty, like Snape, but through momentum that others could see and understand, and, in many cases, could not stop. Because when someone knows exactly what they intend to do, hesitation shifts. It no longer belongs to them, it belongs to everyone else, and that is what made Grindelwald so feared. Not just for what he might do, but for what people realized he was already prepared to do next. Because once that level of certainty is established, opposing it becomes far more difficult. And yet, even that kind of fear has limits. Because the next name on this list did not create fear through vision, but through presence alone. What's interesting is that none of these witches and wizards needed to demand fear. They didn't announce it, they didn't explain it, and in most cases, they didn't even acknowledge it. Because fear in the wizarding world rarely comes from what someone says. It comes from what others believe they might do, and once that belief takes hold, behavior changes. People hesitate, they reconsider, they choose different words, or avoid speaking at all, not because they've been told to, but because it feels safer that way. And that's when fear becomes something else entirely. Not a reaction, but a presence. One that exists before anything happens and lingers long after it's over. Which is what separates power from something far more difficult to challenge. Because the final 2 names on this list didn't just create fear in moments, they carried it with them wherever they went. And few figures embody that more completely than the next name on this list. Number 2. Tom Riddle. Tom Riddle was not always feared. In fact, at first, he was something else entirely. Intelligent, controlled, precise. A student who excelled, and a presence others noticed for all the expected reasons, which is what makes what followed so significant. Because fear did not appear all at once, it built, gradually, deliberately, and without being fully understood until it was already there. The name he later chose changed everything, Voldemort, and with it came something different, not just power, but presence. Because Voldemort did not need to explain himself. He did not need to demonstrate what he was capable of repeatedly or loudly. The understanding was already there, and that is what made him so difficult to oppose. Because by the time his influence was fully recognized, behavior had already changed around him. Conversations became quieter, decisions became slower, and hesitation became the safer option. Not because it was enforced, but because it was expected, which is what separates fear from reputation. Reputation can be challenged, it can be questioned, it can be tested. But fear, once it settles, reshapes everything around it. And Voldemort understood that, because his power was not just in what he could do, but in what others believed he might do next. And once that belief takes hold, it spreads, quietly, consistently, until it becomes part of the world itself, which is why his presence was never limited to a single place or a single moment. It was carried in the decisions others made long before he arrived, and that is what made him so feared, not just as a wizard, but as a possibility others could not ignore. And yet, even that level of fear was not absolute, because there was one figure who others hesitated to stand against for entirely different reasons, and that difference matters. Number 1. Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore was never a figure defined by fear, not in the way others on this list were. He did not create uncertainty like Snape. He did not act without hesitation like Bellatrix, and he did not impose presence in the way Voldemort did. And yet, very few chose to stand directly against him, which raises a different kind of question. What does it mean to be feared without ever demanding it? Because Dumbledore's power was never hidden, his ability was widely recognized, his achievements were known, and his understanding of magic placed him in a position few could approach. But what set him apart was restraint. He did not act unnecessarily, he did not escalate situations without reason, and he did not rely on his reputation to control others, which meant that when he did choose to act, it carried weight. Because nothing about it felt impulsive, it felt considered, and that is where a different kind of fear begins. Not uncertainty, not chaos, not pressure, but understanding. The awareness that if it came to it, there would be very little room to respond. And that awareness changes behavior. It doesn't need to be spoken. It doesn't need to be enforced. It simply exists in the background. Which is why Dumbledore's presence created something few others could. Not fear of action, but hesitation before opposition. Because while others forced the wizarding world to react, Dumbledore made it pause. And that may be the most powerful position of all. Because when people hesitate before challenging you, you no longer need to prove anything at all. Perhaps that's the difference. Some witches and wizards are remembered for what they did, others for what people believed they might do. And once that belief takes hold, it changes everything. Not just decisions, but behavior. Not just moments, but entire outcomes. Which does leave one question. When you think about it, which witch or wizard would you least want to stand opposite? And who do you think people feared for the wrong reasons? Let me know what you think below. And if you find yourself drawn to the more curious corners of the wizarding world, you may want to stay a little longer. There's always more to uncover if you happen to be looking when the clock strikes odd. Not every witch or wizard changes the world with power. Some don't lead armies or challenge entire systems. Some don't even realize what they've set in motion. And yet, long after they're gone, the wizarding world still feels the result. Because change in the wizarding world rarely happens all at once. It begins quietly, a decision made, a belief introduced, a discovery that shifts how magic is understood. And over time, those moments begin to connect. Systems form, traditions take hold, and before anyone fully notices, the world is no longer what it once was. Which means the most important figures in wizarding history are not always the most obvious. They are the ones who altered direction, set new expectations, and left behind consequences that others had to live with. Some names you might expect aren't here, not because they were unimportant, but because this list isn't about who was feared most. It's about what changed, because they existed. Number 7. Godric Gryffindor. Godric Gryffindor is often remembered for bravery. It's the quality most closely associated with his name, the one repeated through generations of students who passed through the house he helped create. But bravery, on its own, does not change the world. What Gryffindor represented did. At a time when magical ability was often kept within certain families, when trust was limited, and when the question of who should learn magic was still being argued, Gryffindor took a different position. He believed that magical ability should be recognized wherever it appeared, Not just inherited, not just expected, but discovered. Which may seem obvious now, but at the time it was not, because that belief directly shaped what Hogwarts would become, a place where witches and wizards from different backgrounds could learn together, develop their abilities, and be judged not by where they came from, but by what they could do. And that shift changed everything. Because once that standard is set, it spreads. It influences how students are taught, how talent is recognized, and eventually how the wizarding world defines itself. Which means Gryffindor's impact is not just tied to a house or even to Hogwarts itself. It is tied to the idea that potential matters more than expectation. And that idea did not remain contained. It shaped generations. Which is why his influence is still felt long after his time. Because some witches and wizards change the world through action, others through what they choose to believe. But not every founder agreed on what the wizarding world should become, because the next name on this list saw things very differently. Number 6. Salazar Slytherin. If Godric Gryffindor represents openness, Salazar Slytherin represents caution, though in practice it went much further than that. As one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts, Slytherin helped shape the same institution that Gryffindor believed should welcome talent wherever it appeared, but Slytherin saw the world differently. He believed that magical ability should be protected, preserved within certain families, and kept separate from those he believed could not be trusted with it. It was not a minor disagreement, it was a fundamental divide, one that could not be resolved through compromise, and eventually it led to his departure from Hogwarts altogether. But Slytherin did not leave without ensuring that his influence would remain. Hidden within the castle he helped build, he left behind something designed to outlast him: the Chamber of Secrets. Not as a lesson, not as a warning, but as a statement, a belief made permanent. And that is where his true impact begins. Because ideas, once embedded, rarely disappear. They are repeated, interpreted, and sometimes taken further than originally intended. Which means Slytherin's influence did not end when he left Hogwarts. It continued, through generations, through decisions, and through actions that would force the wizarding world to confront the consequences of that divide. Because, while Gryffindor shaped what Hogwarts could be, Slytherin shaped what it could become, and not all of those possibilities were welcomed. Because the next figure on this list did not build division, but something far more enduring. Number 5. Rowena Ravenclaw. Rowena Ravenclaw is often associated with intelligence, not simply as a quality but as a principle. Because for Ravenclaw, knowledge was not just valuable, it was essential. As one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts, her influence helped shape not only what students would learn, but how they would approach learning itself. Curiosity, understanding, the pursuit of answers, even when those answers were not immediately useful. These were not just ideas, they became expectations. And expectations, over time, become systems. Which means that much of how magic is studied, refined, and developed can be traced back to foundations laid by witches like Ravenclaw. Her creation of the diadem, said to enhance the wisdom of its wearer, reflects that same belief, that understanding matters, that insight has value, and that knowledge, when pursued properly, becomes a form of power in its own right. But her true influence goes further than any object or lesson. Because once a culture of learning is established, it does not remain contained. It spreads through students, through generations, through the wizarding world itself. Which means Ravenclaw did not simply help build Hogwarts, she helped define how magic would be understood. And that kind of influence does not fade quickly. Because while some witches and wizards change the world through action, others change it through how people think, and that way of thinking tends to last. Because the next name on this list did not just shape ideas, but ensured those ideas would apply to everyone. Number 4. Helga Hufflepuff. If the other founders shaped how Hogwarts would think, Helga Hufflepuff helped decide who it was for. She is often remembered for kindness, for fairness, for an approach to teaching that welcomed those others might overlook. But like Gryffindor's bravery, that simplicity hides something far more significant, because Hufflepuff did not just accept students from different backgrounds, she expected it. At a time when magical education was still being defined, when disagreements over who should be taught were strong enough to divide even the founders themselves, Hufflepuff took a position that was both clear and uncompromising. She would teach everyone, not selectively, not conditionally, but completely, which at the time was not the easy choice. It was the difficult one because it required trust, patience, and a belief that potential exists even where it is not immediately obvious. And like all foundational ideas, it did not remain isolated. It became part of Hogwarts itself, a standard that influenced how students were treated, how houses were formed, and how fairness was understood within the wizarding world. Which makes Hufflepuff's impact easy to underestimate. Not dramatic, not controversial, but deeply embedded. Because, while others argued about who should learn magic, she ensured that the answer would not be limited, and that decision shaped everything that followed. Now, up to this point, change might seem deliberate, a belief chosen, a system built, but not all change begins that way. Some of it happens quietly, unintentionally, and by the time anyone notices, it has already spread. And few figures represent that shift more clearly than the next name on this list. Number 3. Newt Scamander. Newt Scamander is not the kind of wizard most people expect to find on a list like this. He did not seek attention, he did not pursue influence, and he showed little interest in how the wider wizarding world chose to organize itself, which is precisely what makes his impact so significant. Because Newt's focus was never on power, it was on understanding. At a time when many magical creatures were misunderstood, feared, or classified simply as dangerous, Newt approached them differently, not as threats to be controlled, but as beings to be studied, documented, and, where possible, protected. His work led to a deeper understanding of creatures that had long been ignored or misrepresented, and over time, that understanding began to spread. Through his writing, through his fieldwork, and through the students and institutions that would adopt his approach. Which meant the wizarding world began to change, not through conflict, but through perspective. Creatures once feared became better understood, assumptions were challenged, and policies began to reflect a more balanced view of the magical world. And that shift matters, because how something's understood determines how it is treated. Which means Newt did not just catalogue magical creatures, he changed how the wizarding world saw them. And once that perspective changes, it rarely returns to what it was before. Because not all change comes from force, some of it comes from learning to see things differently. And not all of those changes remain small. Because the next figure on this list did not shift understanding quietly, he forced the entire wizarding world to respond. Number 2. Gellert Grindelwald. Gellert Grindelwald did not change the wizarding world quietly, he forced it to respond. Long before his name became associated with conflict, Grindelwald was recognized for his intelligence, his ambition, and his willingness to explore forms of magic others avoided. But what set him apart was not just ability, it was direction. Because Grindelwald was not interested in mastering the world as it was, he wanted to reshape it entirely. His belief that magical society should stand above the non-magical world was not a theory left in discussion. It was something he acted on. And that action changed everything. His influence spread across borders, across institutions, and across a wizarding world that had never been forced to respond at that scale before. systems were challenged, alliances shifted, and the idea of what magical power meant began to change. Because Grindelwald introduced something new, not just conflict, but ideology at scale, a structured vision of how the world should function and the determination to bring that vision into reality, which meant the response to him could not be local or temporary. It had to be coordinated. And once that level of response is required, the world does not return to what it was before. Because Grindelwald didn't just challenge the wizarding world, he changed how it reacted to threat. And that shift from observation to action, from stability to readiness, would define everything that followed. Because once a world learns to defend itself, it is never quite the same again. And yet, even that level of change began somewhere far earlier, with a name that predates all of it. Number 1, Merlin. Long before Hogwarts, before the Ministry, before the structures that now define the wizarding world, there was Merlin. Not simply a powerful wizard, but a figure whose influence became woven into magical history itself. Much of what is known about Merlin is shaped by time, interpretation, and retelling. His life sits at the edge of recorded history, where fact and legend begin to overlap. And yet, his impact is difficult to ignore. He is often associated with early magical knowledge, with ideas that would later influence how magic was understood, and with a philosophy that placed importance on how magic should be used, not just what it could do. But perhaps more significant than anything he accomplished is what followed. Because Merlin became a reference point, a name used to define excellence, to measure achievement, and to represent the highest standard a wizard might reach. Orders were named after him, achievements compared to his, and generations of witches and wizards would be judged against a legacy they could never fully verify, but could not ignore. Which means Merlin did not just influence the wizarding world in his time, he helped define how it understands greatness. And once that standard is set, it shapes everything that comes after. Because every powerful witch or wizard, every figure who changed the course of history, is in some way measured against him. Which makes his impact unique, not tied to a single event or a single decision, but to the idea of what magic could be. And that idea has never truly changed. Perhaps that's the real nature of change in the wizarding world. It doesn't always arrive with noise or announce itself as it happens. More often, it begins quietly. A belief introduced, a decision made, a line crossed or redrawn. And by the time its impact is fully understood, it's already become part of the world itself, long before anyone realized it had changed. Which does leave one question. When you look at the wizarding world as it is now, which witch or wizard do you think shaped it the most? And just as importantly, who do you think history gives too much credit to? Let me know what you think and who you would have included. And if you find yourself drawn to the more curious corners of the wizarding world, you may want to stay a little longer. There's always more to uncover if you happen to be looking when the clock strikes odd. In the wizarding world, power is not always obvious. It isn't just the spells you can cast or the jewels you can win. Sometimes, the most powerful witches and wizards are the ones others speak about, carefully, and in certain cases, the ones the Ministry could not afford to ignore. Because power, in the wizarding world, is rarely just one thing. It can be knowledge, influence, innovation, or the ability to change how magic itself is understood. And while many witches and wizards have been talented, only a few have shaped events in ways that forced the Ministry to take notice, not always with approval, and not always in time. Because in some cases, power does not just draw the Ministry's attention, it forces it to respond. And sometimes, that influence doesn't come from force at all. Number 10. Newt Scamander. Newt Scamander is not the first name most would associate with power. He was not known for dueling, he did not seek political influence, and he showed little interest in authority for its own sake. But power does not always announce itself loudly. Newt was a magizoologist, a specialist in magical creatures, at a time when many were misunderstood, feared, or simply dismissed as dangerous. Through his work, he documented species others avoided, challenged long-held assumptions, and helped reshape how magical creatures were classified and treated. His book, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, became a foundational text, not just for students, but for the ministry itself. Because once knowledge spreads, it becomes influence, and influence, when applied correctly, changes policy. The ministry's approach to magical creatures did not shift overnight, but figures like Newt made it impossible for it to remain the same, which makes his form of power easy to overlook, not aggressive, not political, but quietly transformative. Because while others forced the ministry to react, Newt changed how it thought. And not all forms of power are so subtle. Number 9. Minerva McGonagall. Minerva McGonagall is not often described as one of the most powerful witches of her time. Not because she lacks ability, but because she rarely chooses to display it unnecessarily. A professor of transfiguration and later headmistress of Hogwarts, she is known for precision, discipline, and a level of control that few ever question. But long before she became a defining presence within the castle, McGonagall was already operating at a level that drew wider attention. She trained and worked within the Ministry of Magic's Department of Magical Law Enforcement early in her career, gaining experience in a system that values both competence and discretion. And it is that combination which makes her particularly difficult to measure. Because power, in her case, is not expressed through unpredictability, but through consistency. She does not escalate situations unnecessarily, she does not rely on reputation alone, and she does not make mistakes lightly, which is precisely why, when she does act, it carries weight. During moments of crisis, McGonagall is not the loudest voice in the room, but she is often the one others look to once the situation becomes serious. A strategist, a protector, and a witch capable of adapting faster than most would expect, which places her in a unique position, not feared in the same way as others on this list, but respected in a way that tends to last longer. Because, while some forms of power force attention, others earn it, and few witches of her era have done so more completely. But not everyone who earned the ministry's attention did so by following its rules. Number 8. Severus Snape. Severus Snape is not easily defined. To some, he was a loyal professor, to others, something far less certain. And that uncertainty may be the most important detail of all. Because Snape's power was never obvious, it was not announced or displayed without purpose, it was built quietly. As a student, he showed an unusual aptitude for potion making, refining methods, improving results, and even developing spells of his own, which already placed him ahead of most of his peers. But knowledge alone does not draw the ministry's attention. Application does, and Snape's ability to operate within multiple worlds at once made him something far more difficult to categorize. A teacher, a skilled occlumens, a figure trusted in places where trust was not easily given. He was able to conceal intent, control information, and navigate situations where others would have been exposed almost immediately, which is a different kind of power entirely, not force, not influence, but precision. The ability to act without revealing what that action truly means. And that is what made Snape so significant. Because, while others shaped events from the outside, he altered them from within, quietly, carefully, and often without recognition. Which is perhaps why his role was never fully understood until much later. Because some forms of power are not meant to be seen in the moment, only in the outcome. and not everyone who drew the Ministry's attention did so from within its reach. Number 7. Kingsley Shacklebolt. Kingsley Shacklebolt is what power looks like when it is recognized, not whispered about, not hidden, but trusted. An aura by profession, Kingsley operated within the Ministry of Magic at a level where competence alone was not enough. Precision, judgment, and reliability were expected, not praised. And yet, even within that environment, he stood apart. He was tasked with responsibilities that required both skill and discretion, trusted to act without hesitation and to assess situations others could not easily resolve, which placed him in a position few witches or wizards ever reach. Not just capable, but dependable. And that distinction matters, because while many on this list gained the Ministry's attention through disruption, Kingsley earned it through stability. During periods of uncertainty, when leadership faltered and trust became difficult to place, he was one of the few figures others could rely on without question, a protector, a strategist, and eventually a leader at the very center of the system itself, which makes his form of power particularly significant, not because it forced the Ministry to react, but because it helped define what the Ministry became. And that is a rarer form of influence than most realize, because some witches and wizards shape events from the outside, while others reshape the structure from within. Number 6. Rowena Ravenclaw. Rowena Ravenclaw is not remembered for conflict, nor for conquest, nor for the kind of power that draws immediate attention. And yet, her influence may be among the most far-reaching of any witch in the wizarding world. Long before the Ministry of Magic took shape, before formal systems, regulations, or oversight, Ravenclaw helped establish something far more enduring, a place of learning, a structure where magical ability could be refined, understood, and passed on. As one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts, her contribution was not simply in creating a school, but in shaping how magic itself would be approached. Intelligence, curiosity, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. These were not just values, they became standards. And standards, over time, become systems, which means that much of what the Ministry would later regulate, classify, and attempt to control can be traced back to the foundations laid by witches like Ravenclaw. Her most well-known creation, the diadem, was said to enhance the wisdom of its wearer, a reflection of the importance she placed on understanding over force. But perhaps her greatest influence is less visible, because knowledge, once established, rarely remains contained. It spreads, it evolves, and eventually it shapes the world around it, which makes Ravenclaw's power difficult to measure, not immediate, not aggressive, but enduring. Because, while others forced the wizarding world to react, she helped define how it would think. And not all influence fades with time. Now, it's easy to think of power as something obvious, the spells you can cast, the battles you can win, the reputation you leave behind. But as we've seen, that's only part of the story. Because the Ministry does not respond to all power in the same way, some it studies, some it respects, and some it simply tries to survive. And few figures illustrate that shift more clearly than the next name on this list. Number 5. Salazar Slytherin. Salazar Slytherin is not remembered quietly. Unlike Ravenclaw, whose influence spread through knowledge, Slytherin's legacy is defined by division. As one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts, he helped establish the very institution that would go on to shape the wizarding world. But from the beginning, his vision was not shared by all. Slytherin believed that magic should be taught selectively, that it should remain within certain families, and that opening it too widely carried risks others were not prepared to accept. It was a position that created conflict, not just in theory, but in practice, and eventually it led to his departure from the castle he helped build. But Slytherin did not simply leave. He ensured that something of his remained behind. The Chamber of Secrets, hidden within Hogwarts itself, a structure designed not for teaching but for judgment, and guarded by something few would be capable of controlling, which makes his influence particularly difficult to ignore. Because while others contributed to Hogwarts as a place of learning, Slytherin embedded something else entirely, a mechanism, a message, and a belief that would echo long after he was gone, one that others, generations later, would attempt to follow with consequences the Ministry could not afford to overlook, which is what makes his power so significant, not just in what he achieved, but in what continued to unfold because of it. Because some witches and wizards shape the world in their lifetime, others shape it long after they've left it. Number 4. Bellatrix Lestrange. Bellatrix Lestrange is not a name spoken lightly, not because it is unknown, but because it carries a certain expectation, chaos, precision, and a willingness to act where others hesitate. From an early stage, Bellatrix demonstrated exceptional magical ability. Her control, speed, and confidence in spellwork placed her among the most capable witches of her generation. But ability alone does not define her. It is how she chose to use it. Bellatrix aligned herself completely with a cause that operated in direct opposition to the Ministry of Magic. Not cautiously, not reluctantly, but entirely. And that level of commitment made her particularly dangerous. Because while others might calculate risk, Bellatrix removed hesitation from the equation altogether. She did not second guess. She did not hold back. And she did not appear concerned with consequences in the way others might be, which made her presence difficult to predict and even harder to contain. The Ministry did not simply take notice of Bellatrix Lestrange, it was forced to respond to her again and again. And yet, what makes her power so distinctive is not just her capability, but her certainty, a complete belief in her actions, regardless of outcome. Because while many powerful witches and wizards shape events through influence or control, Bellatrix did so through momentum, fast, unrelenting, and often impossible to redirect once it began. Which is why she stands apart, not simply as a powerful witch, but as a force that others had to account for, whether they were prepared or not. And yet, even Bellatrix's influence was part of something larger. Because the next name on this list did not just challenge the Ministry, he forced it to confront a far greater threat. Number 3. Gellert Grindelwald. Gellert Grindelwald did not simply challenge the wizarding world, he attempted to redefine it. Long before his name became associated with conflict, Grindelwald was recognized for his intellect, his ambition, and his willingness to explore forms of magic others considered too dangerous to pursue. Even as a student, his ideas set him apart, not just in ability, but in direction. Because Grindelwald was not interested in mastering magic as it existed, he was interested in what it could become, and, more importantly, who should control it. His philosophy, that magical society should operate above the non-magical world, was not simply theoretical. It was something he intended to act upon, which transformed him from a thinker into a figure the wider wizarding world could not ignore. His influence spread beyond a single country, beyond a single institution, until it reached a scale that demanded a coordinated response. And at that point, the Ministry was no longer observing, it was reacting. Because Grindelwald's power was not built on unpredictability, like Bellatrix, nor on secrecy, like Snape. It was built on belief, a clear, structured vision of how the world should function, and the determination to bring that vision into reality, which made him extraordinarily difficult to oppose. Because when power is supported by conviction, it becomes something more than ability. It becomes momentum, and momentum, once established, is not easily stopped, which is why Grindelwald's actions forced the wizarding world to respond at a level it had rarely faced before. And yet, even that level of influence had its limits, because the next name on this list did not just challenge the wizarding world, he changed how it understood fear. Number 2. Tom Riddle. Tom Riddle is not remembered for subtlety, though in the beginning that is exactly how he operated. Intelligent, composed, and highly capable, he was recognized early as a wizard of exceptional promise, a student who excelled, a presence that drew attention for all the right reasons, which makes what followed far more significant. Because Riddle did not simply develop power, he pursued it, deliberately, relentlessly, and without the limitations others might accept. His understanding of magic extended into areas few were willing to explore, not just to learn, but to control. And over time, that pursuit transformed him into something else entirely. A figure no longer operating within the expectations of the wizarding world, but outside of them, which is when the Ministry's role changed. Because it was no longer observing a powerful individual, it was responding to a threat that affected every part of magical society. Systems disrupted, authority challenged, stability replaced with uncertainty, and all of it centered around a single name: Voldemort. His influence was not just widespread, it was invasive. It altered behavior, changed alliances, and forced even the most capable witches and wizards to act differently. Which is what makes his power so significant, not just in what he could do, but in what others believed he might do next. Because fear, when it reaches that level, becomes a force in its own right. And yet, even at the height of that influence, there remained one figure the wizarding world turned to anyway. Not because he was louder, not because he was feared, but because he was trusted. Number 1. Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore is rarely introduced as one of the most powerful wizards of his time, because by the point his name is mentioned, that fact is already understood. His ability was never in question. From an early age, Dumbledore demonstrated a level of magical talent that set him apart, not just from his peers, but from expectations entirely. His work in Transfiguration, his discoveries, and his contributions to magical understanding established him as a figure the wider wizarding world could not ignore. But ability alone does not explain his position. Because Dumbledore's influence extended far beyond what he could do, it extended into what he chose not to do. Positions of authority were offered and declined, power was available and set aside. Which is far more difficult than it sounds, because power is easiest to recognize when it is used, not when it is restrained. Influence was constant, but rarely used without purpose, which created something unusual: a wizard whose strength was recognized without needing to be demonstrated. The Ministry did not simply take notice of Dumbledore, it deferred to him, because when situations escalated beyond control, when threats reached a level others could not contain, he was the figure they relied on. Not out of obligation, but out of understanding. Because Dumbledore's power was not built on fear, like Voldemort, nor on ideology, like Grindelwald. It was built on mastery, of magic, of judgment, and perhaps most importantly, of restraint, which is what truly set him apart. Because in a world where power is often defined by how far it is pushed, Dumbledore proved something far more difficult: that the greatest power may lie in choosing not to use it at all, and that is something the Ministry could never afford to ignore. Power in the wizarding world is rarely as simple as it first appears. It isn't just the spells a witch or wizard can cast, or the reputation they leave behind. Sometimes it's influence, sometimes it's belief, and sometimes the kind of power the Ministry never fully managed to control or contain. Which does leave one question. When you think about it, who truly belongs at the top of a list like this? And just as importantly, who doesn't? Let me know what you think and who you would have included. And if you find yourself drawn to the more curious corners of the wizarding world, you may want to stay a little longer. There's always more to uncover if you happen to be looking when the clock strikes odd. Imagine discovering an entirely new society, a hidden magical world filled with ancient secrets, enchanted castles, and spells capable of bending reality itself. And then discovering their accounting system appears to have been designed by a confused goblin after a particularly stressful afternoon. Because wizard money makes absolutely no sense. If you've ever wondered why young witches and wizards look mildly concerned every time they're asked to pay for something, the answer is surprisingly simple. The wizarding economy uses 3 different coins: nuts, sickles, and galleons, which sounds straightforward enough until someone explains the exchange rates. There are 29 nuts in a sickle and 17 sickles in a galleon, not 30, not 20, not 10, 29 and 17. Numbers apparently selected by throwing darts at a wall. This means that performing even basic arithmetic requires either remarkable concentration or the willingness to simply trust the nearest goblin, which, to be fair, is exactly what most witches and wizards seem to do. Need to buy a wand?
No problem.
Need to calculate your change? That's suddenly an advanced magical discipline. Naturally, this raises an important question. Why? Why create a currency system so spectacularly inconvenient? Well, according to wizarding tradition, these denominations are centuries old, which is wizarding shorthand for, we've always done it this way and nobody wants the paperwork. A philosophy the Ministry of Magic appears to embrace with alarming enthusiasm. Of course, things become even more interesting when you remember that the entire economy is effectively centered around a single bank, a bank operated entirely by goblins. Imagine if every financial institution in Britain suddenly became one enormous building and everyone collectively agreed that this was perfectly sensible. That's essentially the wizarding approach. Then there are school supplies. A first-year student needs books, robes, a wand, potion ingredients, various magical accessories, and somehow every parent already knows exactly how much money to withdraw, despite using a currency system that resembles an arithmancy exam. Perhaps the strangest part is that almost nobody in the wizarding world seems bothered by any of this. There are dragons, ghosts, moving staircases, portraits that offer unsolicited opinions. Yet somehow, the most unbelievable part of wizarding society may be the fact that everybody agreed 29 was a sensible number to put into circulation. So the next time someone tells you magic makes life easier, remember that somewhere in the wizarding world, a perfectly qualified adult wizard is standing in a shop trying to calculate whether 3 sickles and 11 nuts is enough to buy a packet of chocolate frogs and quietly wishing they paid more attention in maths. Which does leave one important question. If you could change one thing about the wizarding world, what would it be? Because I suspect wizard currency may not survive the first round of voting. And if you find yourself drawn to the stranger corners of the wizarding world, you may want to stay a little longer. There's always more to uncover if you happen to be looking when the clock strikes odd. For a society capable of producing highly advanced magic, the wizarding world has always shown a slightly concerning attitude toward sweets.